So good morning everybody and welcome to today's presentation, which is all about the APM Competence Framework. That's the new second edition that's been recently published. Speaking to you today, I'm very conscious that we're not on camera. So my name's Eileen Roden and I work as an independent trainer and consultant around PMOs and project management, member of the PMO Specific Interest Group Committee, and also contributed to the constitution and the makeup of the competence framework. With me today, not quite in his best bib and tucker as shown on the photograph, is Simon George, and I'll just let him introduce himself.
Good morning everybody. My name's Simon George and I'm also a member of the PMO SIG committee. I'm bringing some real life experience to today's webinar. We've been trying to implement the competences, so we'll let you know in the future how that goes. I've been in IT for about 40 years now and part of PMOs and setting up PMOs for probably 30 of those. So it's I'm hoping to bring some experience to answer a lot of your questions about this.
So today's talk is really to introduce the second edition of the APM Competence Framework. Now, some of you may know that there has already been a generic presentation done that's available on YouTube and via the APM website. So we're not going to go into as much detail of the basics of the APM Competence Framework. The real kind of focus about today is really looking about the new role profiles that have been developed as part of this second edition and how they can be used by PMO professionals as individuals, or actually if you want to use them in your PMOs and you've got a group or an organisation with more than one PMO professional in it. So as we go through the presentation, as has already been identified, you will be on mute. But what you do have is the opportunity to ask questions. We have Sarah with us, who's going to be collecting those questions and will be dealing with those live at the end of the session. Also, if we get a huge number of questions, what Simon and I will do before we leave is we'll make sure we've got an answer for all of those, and they will be included and attached to the presentation when it becomes available online. We'll stick in a few extra slides in the end and then you'll have those answers as well. So don't forget to put those in the question box if you can kind of see that on your screen. So in terms of the agenda, we're going to spend just a few minutes going back over the structure of the competence framework just to make sure we all have the basics in place. We're then going to look specifically at the PMO role profiles, what they are, and a little bit about the structure of each individual role profiles, and we will look at a small part of an example of one of them. And then we're going to talk about the different types of PMO and how you can use those role profiles in those different types of PMOs and how they would work. And then finally, we're going to talk about how they can actually be used for identifying professional development for yourselves and other people within your PMO. And as Simon mentioned, he's going to give us a real-life example of how that's currently being used and how it reflects some of the moves he's made within his career. So, onto the structure of the APM Competence Framework. The second edition has been consolidated and been much more user-friendly than the previous competence framework. And what the competencies, we've consolidated them down into 27. Now these 27 competencies are the same competencies for all of the role profiles, whether that be portfolio management, program management, project management, or PMO. So that knowledge, the base knowledge that we all use to do our day-to-day job is the same. However, how we apply them and our experience amongst these 27 competencies will vary from role to role and depending on kind of whereabouts you are in your career. So that's the new 27 competencies. As I mentioned, they are available in detail on the APM website, and you can go and watch in a little bit more detail on the previous webinar. So within each of those 27 competencies, what we have is a rating scale. So as ever, we have it split into both application and knowledge. And for application, you have a scale of 1 to 5. from being aware of the competency up through practiced, competent, proficient, and then expert. And we have the same in relation to knowledge. Now, one of the really good things of the new competence framework, and if you have a look over to the right-hand side, it actually talks about and it articulates what it would mean at each of those levels. So if you have a look for application at level 1 away, they can clearly communicate and reinforces to team members and stakeholders the vision, values and objectives of the change initiative and its links to strategic objectives. So that, in terms of the kind of the leadership competence, is what we would expect to see. So somebody who is a level 1 in application. Whereas if you kind of jump up to level 5 in application, you've got something like consistently models desirable behaviours in order to encourage similar behaviours from others. So it means rather than just being left to kind of score yourself 1 to 5, you can actually look at the descriptors and starting to recognise what is it I do. And I think the other thing to note is that you may recognise that you do a bit of all of those 5. And then what I would suggest, it's really about looking at what you spend the majority of your time doing will give you a proper indicator of the level that you're actually at. So that's the new competence framework, 27 competences, 5 levels for knowledge and application, and a description of what's expected from each of those levels to help you with the scoring, which we'll talk about later. And you'll see at the bottom of that screen that it's available to download for free at the APM website. So one of the really good things that has been a development within this 2nd edition is role profiles, and there are role profiles for program management, portfolio management and project management, and what we're going to focus on specifically is the role profiles for PMO. Now there are actually 4 role profiles for PMO. We have the PMO administrator, we have a PMO officer who may, and as Simon will talk about very shortly, be a PMO specialist at that level. We have a PMO manager and also the portfolio analyst. So in terms of each of the role profiles, let's just have a look at what the structure would be of those role profiles. So each role profile looks at the particular, whichever those 4 roles it is, and will say each role has a key responsibility, and under that has, for each of the relevant competence, it articulates how that competence is applied for that role, for that key responsibility. So it's quite a kind of a detailed role profile for each of those 4 profiles provided. And I think it's probably worth going and having a look at a little bit more detail, so that might make a little bit more sense. So let's have a look at the portfolio analyst profile. So this is one of the profiles that's been provided, and one of the key responsibilities is there in that top box there. So it says a portfolio management office analyst is likely to be responsible for applying the following independently in situations of limited complexity. Now I just want to pick up a couple of key words from that sentence, because you'll notice that all of the key responsibilities kind of pivot around these 3 words. So the first word is responsible. So that means they kind of can do that, and the other word there is independently. So from an analyst, a portfolio analyst perspective, they can actually undertake that role. They don't need kind of direct supervision. They're not just being doing as they're told. They actually kind of understand it and need a level of competence and knowledge and experience in order to be able to do that. So those are 2 key words. And I think the other key words in there are about limited complexity. As you kind of progress through your career and as you need to score higher in the competence framework and the scoring framework, it would expect you to be able to do that with greater levels of complexity. So you'll find the words limited complexity and complexity and high complexity appear with those key responsibilities. So just for this one key responsibility, I've just kind of picked up the first 4 competencies that are described in the role profile. So the first competence, number 1, is about ethics, compliance and professionalism. So we give a description there, and we would say that a portfolio analyst at this level would actually promote the wider public good in their actions, act in a morally, legally and socially appropriate manner in dealings with stakeholders and members of portfolio teams in the organisation. So that's in portfolio analyst working at this level. That's what we would expect to see from the first competence. Competence 2 doesn't appear for this particular responsibility. Competence 3, which is conflict management, we would expect a portfolio analyst to be able to identify, address and resolve differences between individuals and or interest groups. So we want, so again, somebody who can do this independently, who can actually kind of deal with conflict and resolve conflict among some of the stakeholders in and around the project management area. 2 other that I'm not going to go into as much detail there. You'll see competence 12 there, which is risk, opportunity and issue management, and also competence 14 there, which is around consolidated planning. Sorry, I missed that bit. So that's around consolidated planning. So you can see there's a real kind of richness of the job role that's been described, and within the portfolio analyst profile there are 4 key responsibilities identified and a greater list of all of those competencies that are relevant to that particular responsibility. So just to kind of, those are the 4 role profiles that we're going to talk about. What we want to do now is put those in context, and we're going to talk about the different types of PMO and how those profiles might be used. And I think the first thing we need to do is clarify what the P stands for. So we recognise that PMO has become a generic term, and it could relate to a project office, a programme office or a portfolio office, and often PMOs in organisations do a whole mixture, and I know your assignment does a mixture of a few of those, isn't it, in TFL. So we're going to look at kind of how they might apply. We are going to kind of separate them off into the different offices so we can see where those profiles may work and how the names are used. So if you work in a PMO that is dedicated to one single project and they've been set up to support that project, we would use that, the terminology when we go through the example is going to be a project office. If you work in a PMO where you look after multiple projects, so you may actually be called a project office, or you may be a program office, depending on the organisation. If you work in a PMO, which just looks after one single program, again, you would be referred to as a program office. And if you work in a PMO which looks after multiple projects and programs, you are either going to be called a program office or a portfolio office. So that's the kind of, when we talk through the next section that Simon's going to take us through with each of the individual role profiles and how they're used. When we're talking about project office, program office and portfolio office, that's the kind of categorization that we're going to be looking at. So Simon's going to take us through what that means in terms of the actual profiles themselves.
Okay, so we're going to place the profiles into the relevant project, program or portfolio office. So when we're looking at a project office, typically we'll have a PMO manager, a real hands-on role here, probably somebody who has some of the specialisms that we would look at in a specialist, but given it's such a small office, they would be incorporating that in one role. They would be supported probably by an administrator, somebody who is document management perhaps, and certainly chasing people for plans and things like that. Obviously, in a small project office, you may only be 2-3 people at most. So that's where I started. That's when when I first started in 1992, that is exactly what I was. I was the PMO manager, and I had 2 assistants who didn't know anything about anything except typing. And we built a project office, so it was quite new in those days.
And quite often we would have a project office where we might only have 1 person, and they may either be a manager or a PMO administrator. And we always like to refer to those as POOs, a project office of 1, because that's kind of sometimes how it feels when you're dealing with all of the information that you need.
It did, yes, and certainly once I'd set the project office up, I moved back to being a project manager again, which is what I'd been doing before that. And the lady who had been my assistant took over the role, and she was a role of 1 for a while. Exactly that.
Excellent.
Okay, if we're moving on to the program office, what we're looking at here is obviously still having a PMO manager, perhaps now somebody who is more of a person manager than they are doing any of the specialism roles in a PMO. What you've probably got though is you've got some people who are quite generically trained in PMO roles. They know a bit about risk, a bit about planning, a bit about assurance. They're probably all of a muchness now. You've got several people all doing the same sort of roles. And you're probably still supported though by an administrator or 2 to sort of pick up the pieces, I think is the term. And then finally we're looking at portfolio office, and once you've gone beyond just managing multiple programs and projects, at some point somebody will ask the key question, why are you doing all of these things? And then the question is, well, actually, you're quite right, we don't have any way of justifying what we do, we just do everything we're given. So you sort of morph into a portfolio office who has some responsibility for building business cases, for presenting back to the business what you think are the best candidates, best bang for the buck, so that, you know, that what they get out of it is the best return on the investment. So at this point, certainly you've got a PMO manager, but now he's moved up in the organisation and is quite key to the strategy, delivering the strategy of the organisation. What you've got below that is probably some people who have moved out of generic roles and are now quite key specialists, and they're looking at risk or planning or assurance, and these can be multiple people teams in their own right. Obviously there are people moving up in those specialisms. You've got your PMO officers and your assistants. They still have a role to play, but you're becoming quite focused and putting people into little silos here. And I'll go into this a bit later, because that is exactly where my organisation is at the moment.
And certainly when I used to run a PMO when I was at Cadbury's, we had generic PMO specialists, general PMO officers, who each picked up a specialist as well. So they would provide generic support to a number of projects, but one of the officers would then pick up planning, one of the officers would also then pick up risks, and one of the officers would pick up the systems.
Yeah, and certainly we've started that way. We're now extending out so that people who picked up those specialisms are becoming even more embedded in the specialisms. And what we've gained is around a dozen PMO, what we're calling PMO analysts, who are considered to be PMO officers in this role, who are actually embedded into the projects and programs, who are delivering that day-to-day PMO support, and we're acting maybe more as a local centre of excellence.
And when we talk about having those 4 different roles in a portfolio office, we're not necessarily saying you will have all 4, because some portfolio officers will purely focus on the analysis of the portfolio and kind of supporting the board in decision making, and they may have a separate program office that pick up the kind of the specialists and the administrators.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, I'm currently involved in specifying the role for a portfolio manager and management office. However, it's very key that this is not going to be replacing what will probably still stay a program management office, but we'll be supporting that function with a lot of the planning and risk management.
Yes. So I think what we've tried to do is give an indication of what the roles may be in a project, program or portfolio office. We're certainly not trying to be prescriptive and say these roles can only be in these offices. We're just trying to give a typical example of kind of how they would work in the real world, and it certainly aligns with Simon's experience and mine in running PMOs. So the next thing we just want to cover off is about how you can actually use them, these role profiles and the APM Competence Framework. So the first thing that we have, which is downloadable again from the APM website, is an assessment score sheet. So this is a very kind of pretty version of a spreadsheet, which basically allows you to document and assess yourself on the scores for each of the 27 competencies, and it allows you to score yourself for both knowledge and experience. And there's also some on the right hand, the very right hand column there, is to just document and articulate the types of activities you do, almost providing evidence for the activities that you undertake. So if you have access just to the APM Competence Framework, what you can do is you can undertake your self-assessment with a view to looking at those competencies where you have a lower score or no score at all, and really start looking at the areas where you can focus your continuous professional development over the next 6, 12, 18 months. And hopefully some of the articulation of what that competency means in action will allow you to identify either some work activities or some shadowing activities or some training or some mentoring, so all of the various different areas that you can do development from that competence framework. If you have access to both the competence framework and the role profiles, then you do have the opportunity to do something to the kind of with a little bit more detail. So again, you would do a self-assessment to look at where my current skills and capabilities are in the various 27 competencies. But then what I can do if I have access to the role profiles is I can say, well, at the moment I am, I think my role is a PMO officer role, and I can look at the competencies and the levels and the scoring for those competencies for the role profile for the PMO officer, and say, well, actually there are a few competencies where I actually don't score as highly as the generic PMO officer role might be. So what that allows us to do is be able to pinpoint specific areas for development that bring me up to the kind of the typical PMO officer role. At the same time, if you currently are a PMO officer and looking for a promotion and are looking to kind of applying for jobs at a PMO manager level, then perhaps what you want to do is not just a gap analysis against your current role, but do a gap analysis against the role that you're looking to be promoted up to. So that can either be the administrator going up to the officer, or the officer up to the manager, or kind of either of those going up to the portfolio analyst. So it allows you to do a more pinpointed development plan for you for the next 6, 12 to 18 months. So that's how you would do it as an individual. For those of you who work in organisations where you have an established PMO and you have multiple roles within your PMO, then you can use both the competence framework and the role profiles in order to kind of help you design the structure and the detail of the roles within the PMO. So if you've got just the APM competence framework, then you can determine the roles that are required in your specific organisation, and you can use the competence framework to actually select which competencies are relevant for your organisation and what level of competence is required for both knowledge and experience. If you do have access to the role profiles also, again, you still need to determine the roles that are required in your organisation, because the APM Competence Framework, and rightly so, doesn't say this is the structure of your PMO. You will need to kind of do that work. But what you can do is then look at the role profiles that are provided and say, well, actually, that's a good starter for 10. But perhaps there may be some elements where your particular organisation uses things in a little bit more detail, or perhaps, you know, if you think of some of the competence elements, we're not really kind of sophisticated or mature users in our organisation, so actually we need a slightly lower score on those. You can actually kind of tailor those role profiles to be specific to your organisation, but it actually gives you a good starter for 10 in terms of kind of what you can be looking for, either from a recruitment or kind of both internally and externally, but also promoting people to the right roles within your organisation, and then again use them for development for people within your PMO. Just to kind of bring that into context, I think Simon's got a really good kind of demonstration of how they're actually used in practice.
Okay, thank you, Eileen. Right, now this is a real life example. There's a lot of jobs here. What you're seeing on the left-hand side is the traditional sort of PPM, Assistant Project Manager, Senior Project Manager, Program Manager. In our organisation, we call people who run a discrete area of projects and programs and portfolio manager, although that's a bit of a misnomer. However, that might change. What you're seeing on the right-hand side, though, is the work I'm involved with is delivering the PMO competencies and role profiles. Now, not all of these jobs are in my PMO by a long shot, but what we're trying to provide here is all the levels that we think people need. We need job descriptions available to be able to put people in our organisation. So, for instance, though, it's very clear that, and it's on the diagram, the central PMO is the owner of our methods and standards, and therefore they are the key leads in both risk, planning, especially in the methods and standards lifecycle, controls and assurance. Below that, though, is where my local PMO lives, and it's implementing those methods and standards alongside the local methods and standards that are applicable. So it's very much my team is delivering specialist roles, leading specialist teams, delivering what central PMO wants. So I have a team of people who are these specialists. Now they've come up over the last 3 or 4 years from being non-PMO people, or what I call generic PMO people. So they've had skills and knowledge in a multiple of areas, and a bit about planning, a bit about risk, a bit about assurance. But we're now moving those people into specialist roles, and they themselves are gaining small teams in their own right to support them, who are themselves a bit more generic, but are starting to focus on the specialisms. Also, what we're introducing, which sort of partly covers controls but partly is assurance, is we have a new role called a PMO analyst, which is a PMO officer, but it's out there, as I mentioned earlier, in the wider program and project world, doing hands-on PMO stuff, and then reporting back to us and letting us to help with issues, and but also chasing people to sort things out. Because there's no doubt about it, once you've got sort of 1,100 people doing their own thing, it can take quite a bit of control to keep them on the straight and narrow. So certainly there are 27 roles here in the PMO area. I've got a team though of 16 using the just to show you how this would have been really useful in my own career. I've put some
animation's not working.
Right, sorry, here we go. I started out, funnily enough, back in the days when PMOs were. So we're talking here about I was a developer, I was a programmer and tester. By the mid-80s, though, I was working alongside a project manager, sort of doing a technical lead role, but helping him to do some planning and some reporting and stuff like that. and I moved up to being a project manager in the mid-80s. So at the time, though, it was just that was a natural progression. You only got somewhere, and you had to move out of a development role in order to progress. You then became a project manager.
Those days have changed, thankfully.
Thankfully, yes. What then happened is that over a few years, I gained quite a level of expertise in planning. It was one of the sort of first, what I call specialisms that certainly project managers gained. I wouldn't say there's so hot on risk, and there's certainly they don't like assurance, but you have to be quite a good planner to be a project manager. And so it came to the point where I was becoming I wouldn't call specialist, but I was certainly a competent PMO officer around planning, and therefore was involved in writing planning standards and sort of determining standard reporting from those plans, so progress reporting.
So were you officially called a PMO officer?
No, I never was ever called a PMO officer. I was just a project manager that happened to be the person who did planning.
And I think that's important, isn't it? Because for all of these role profiles have got names, very often what we see in organisations are completely different names. But these role profiles are still relevant because it describes what that individual does on a day-to-day basis.
Absolutely. I mean, if I'd recognised at the time that I was moving into being effectively, eventually, a specialist planner role, it would have been really quite useful, but I didn't recognise that. I didn't recognise it was happening at the time. What happened on the back of that, though, is that somebody said to me, if you've got everybody to plan well like this, and then we'd have consistent plans and consistent reporting of progress across our organisation. So I was asked to become a PSO manager, which is a project support office manager. So at that point, I actually moved out of being a project manager to set the project support office up. And that was
an unashamed PMO person.
An unashamed PMO, and recognised as such. PMO still didn't exist officially, though. I think it was back in the days when, I think project support office was about as grand as you got. So I moved, after we'd set the PSO up, I moved back into project and program management. So, I was back in there for quite a few years, but I always was involved then in methods and standards and planning. I was still involved in those areas, and certainly by the 2000s, I deliberately took a move out of project and program management and moved into a PMO world. Initially as planning controls, planning systems, document control systems, more of a tool specialist, but involved with PMO, and I've stayed pretty much there ever since, and I now run effectively a PMO. This structure is me and my team.
So it's quite interesting. We were having a conversation before we started the webinar, Simon. When you were in these various roles, there was no, well, the competence framework certainly wasn't around then, but there was no role profiles, there was no generic role profiles for you to use as a basis for putting your own job description together.
There certainly wasn't, no. I've always written my own job descriptions pretty much my whole career, which is an interesting concept in that I've always decided almost what it is that I wanted to do and then sold it to people. And they said, yes, absolutely.
And as we kind of mentioned, the PMOs now, they're certainly more recognised and they're certainly more prolific in organisations. So when in the new kind of role families that have been kind of set up at TFL, how useful have the role profiles been to give you that kind of starting point, and have you done much tailoring?
We've done quite a lot of tailoring because the generic roles take you to the point where you understand the competence levels of, say, the specialist. However, what they don't do is actually tell you what the specialism is. So you have to start splitting it up. And if you do want somebody who is the risk specialist, you have to then tailor the profile to concentrate on risk.
So they'll have a much more kind of a higher level of competence for whatever they're specialised in.
In the specialism, yes. You wouldn't expect them, obviously, to become a specialist in everything.
Okay.
I mean, wonderful if they could be, but unlikely.
Unlikely. Excellent. Well, I hope that's been useful to kind of see how they've actually been used in practice. So that kind of covers off the main part of our talk, as I say, just to give you an indication of what's in the new second edition, what the role profiles are, an example of a role profile, and then how they're used in project, programme and portfolio officers, and also Simon to take us through then how they're used in practice. If you do want to find any more information, you can visit the APM website. There is a frequently asked questions sections on there. You can contact the APM directly, or you can actually contact the PMO SIG, and other people on the PMO SIG committee can also provide some help and support. The best way to get in touch with that is usually through our LinkedIn group, so do come and find us there. So as promised, hopefully Sarah's got a selection of questions that she's now going to kind of fire at Simon and I. There may be a deep breath and a couple of short intakes of breath, because these are not pre-prepared questions. They are definitely questions that have come through the presentation.
Okay, guys, starting off with our first question that's come in. What roles does the specialist roles cover?
Shall I take that one? It pretty much can be a specialism in any role that you want in your project management office. If you look at my real life example, it's quite clear that we're looking at specialisms in risk, planning, methods and standards, controls and assurance. However, the department I work in, which the PMO is effectively part of, has cost management, it has resource management, and I can see that you might well want specialist roles focusing on resource management and capabilities themselves. So it's really, what do you need in your organisation? We started out focusing on my, in effect, PMO. However, you can spread those competencies out to the whole of the support organisation.
And there's also a benefits specialist as well.
There is.
Now, so in terms of benefits and value, which, as we know, is an area of specific interest of a lot of organisations at the moment.
That's right, and it sort of goes along with the portfolio management. We're having a specialist in benefits management to support the portfolio manager process.
So I think it goes back to kind of each of these role profiles may need some tailoring for your organisation, and the generic role profile officer specialist provides the basis for somebody who knows a bit about everything, and then you'll take that, and whichever particular specialism you want, you will look at the competence that's relevant and provide some additional information on that.
Absolutely, yes. You've got to turn it into that somebody can work to.
Okay. Can you consolidate the roles?
Well, I think what we talked about in the example that we covered off was certainly if you've got a project office, it's highly likely that that starts off with as a project office of one, or even a kind of, and both the project manager, the PMO manager, and the PMO administrator, to a large extent, do similar kind of roles, even though the manager may have some additional management responsibility. So it may be kind of a mixture of both of those roles. And again, what we would say is have a look at if you've just got the competence framework, just go through the competencies and pick what you think is most relevant for the role that you'll be undertaking, a bit what Simon did before you had anything to work from. Or if you've got the role profiles, have a look at the two role profiles and see what you think is most applicable for what is going to be that combined role. Nobody's got these role profiles are there as really as an indicator rather than a standard that everybody will be working to.
Okay. Again, if you wouldn't mind just clarifying, what does a PMO stand for?
So the PMO is either a portfolio office, a program office, or a project office. And if you want to think about kind of what the PMO is there to do, it really has two key roles. Firstly, it provides delivery support from either kind of hands-on, right-hand man of a project manager, or support for the systems and processes that project managers use. And the second role of a PMO is really around decision enabling. So it provides all of the project and program data for which the relevant people in the organisation can make decisions. So again, that could be the project manager, could be the program manager, or it could be the senior executive when we're talking about approving projects, deciding which projects are going to be in the portfolio for the next 1 year, 5-year program.
Okay, in the real life example that was shown, where do the benefits or value management specialists sit?
That's an interesting question. In fact, it doesn't live in that organisation. It lives in the Portfolio Management Office, which is where we're going now. I've just produced a specification using the new competency for portfolio managers, not in the PMO, which is it's a discrete team providing portfolio management processes, pipeline, benefits management, benefits identification, management and realization, so that the business can make decisions on what they're going to run. A program management office is there to support those things that are already running. Sometimes we recommend they're stopped. However, in the main, it's making sure that people are doing the right things and they're not getting sidetracked, that change is being properly managed and whatever. The portfolio office, though, is much more looking at what's the bigger strategic plan over the next few years. Therefore, what projects do we need to run next year and beyond? So the benefits manager is building a case for each of those things which might become an active project or program.
Okay. What do you mean when you say I set up a project support office? What did you do?
It's interesting. I said somebody just said to me, I would like you to introduce some standards around planning and reporting. So my initial reaction was, what, on my own? And I said, well, for a start, once we've actually got this up and running, somebody's going to need to collect the data. They're going to need to be going around, getting progress reports, keeping the plans up to date. So the instinctive reaction was, and also, what happens when I go on holiday? So it became very quickly an office of two. I can't see a project support office existing as a single person, because by the very nature of it being a single person, if you're sick or on holiday, it stops working. But it doesn't have to be much larger. At that point, I think we never got beyond 3, and it went back to 2 when I moved back into the project management area, and having been setting it up.
I think when we're setting up a project office, it's one of those kind of things that's quite easy to say, but we don't necessarily recognise how different it can be from organisation to organisation. So you were very fortunate, Simon, because you had some real kind of, somebody actually asked you to do it.
Yes.
Often it sometimes happens, as I think you gave the example when you were doing your planning, you just became kind of known to be the person who knew how to do the planning, and you almost kind of, it's almost an accidental kind of project office where you get nuggets of kind of excellence, and people kind of start using that, and then it gradually becomes a little bit more formalized. So I wouldn't suggest every PMO, every project office that gets set up goes through some formal process. Sometimes it kind of, it floats into being because of those specialisms, and then you may get some kind of formal structure where you start having a little bit more authority to kind of roll out those processes across the organisation.
Yeah, and I think there are small organisations now where that will still be happening. Certainly, though, there was no structure available that we could work to or recognise when I started. So it was really just a natural progression through my career that ended me up setting up something which was a support office.
This is a great question. How do you get your PMO and project managers working in harmony?
You give them all the same hymn sheet.
You do. I mean, one of the things that obviously we're doing is we're sort of saying, well, this is what you must do. This is the way you should be doing it. This is how you need to report. This is how you need to plan. What we do is we engage with them. We explain that to them at the beginning when they start. We have inductions. We do training on the various aspects of the processes and tools. It's an open door policy. Anybody can walk up and ask us a question at any time. You know, we don't hide ourselves away, because the point is we are part of what is known as the PPM job family. We're not separate to it. We're part of the same job family, and therefore part of what's nice about it is that you can see across how somebody of a level of competence in, say, risk specialism is equivalent to a senior project manager. It's really quite nice that we're now recognising that there is a level of knowledge and competencies in the PMO that is the equivalent of project and program managers, which is really quite nice, because I think a lot of people in the past have said, oh, it's just the PMO, they're a bunch of administrators. And certainly when I started out writing the first sets of JDs for my team, the HR people who came in and looked at them and Hayes scored them just marked us as typists, because they couldn't see we were doing anything else but sitting at computers typing stuff.
So I think this, you pick up an interesting point in terms of kind of approaches to deciding on what functions and services are actually provided by a PMO. And it's always interesting in terms of where the drive from the PMO comes from, in terms of, are we there, going back to kind of delivery support and decision enabling. Some organisations were there to kind of support the project and program managers deliver their projects and programs. In other organisations, there's a much greater drive kind of from top down about wanting to understand where the projects or programs are, and the services we provide in the PMO are much more around the decision enabling piece, and perhaps don't even offer any kind of hands-on support to project or program managers at all. So it's quite interesting in terms of how your PMO is or is not accepted by your project managers, depending on the level of support that they are provided with, but also the level of kind of instruction and diktat that you give them without any kind of question or out any discussion, because it's there provided for the senior managers. And certainly good practice would say to think very carefully when you're putting together those functions and services and balancing off those kind of some of the kind of dictated services perhaps with some of the services that the project managers might see of more use to them. And it's always a challenge to keep your PMO both kind of current and value add to both the delivery teams but also the senior management.
I think you have to be in constant contact with your customers, in effect, in the project management community. If you become a pure centre of excellence, I think, and potentially seen to be in an ivory tower, I think you become irrelevant very quickly, because people will do their own thing. You have to not only be delivering the methods and standards and stuff like that, but you have to be there to help them through it, so that, you know, there are people who are excellent people managers and they're good project managers. However, their planning skills may not be up to scratch, and therefore you've got to be there to help them, because then next year they'll go, well, they were really helpful last year. There was a good bunch of people. You should go to them. They'll promote you.
And I think it's quite interesting how the word, you know, it's not that long ago when we had project support officers and program support officers, and there's definitely been a move to kind of management officers, because we want to be seen as administrators, so we've taken that word support out. But the reality of the situation is, it is a support function. It is there to support the delivery of the projects and programs.
Absolutely. We've still got the document configuration and the tools support administrators. They're still there. They still have a very vital function. But yes, a lot of what we do now is more about gathering of data for the senior management to make some decisions.
Okay, I've got a question here, just 1 second. There has been no mention of P30. How does this link into a PMO organisation?
So the P30 is the best management practice guidance that's owned by Axelos. So they have set up some generic role descriptions but don't have any detailed role profiles. So the two are not mutually exclusive at all. This provides a little bit more detail against some specific competencies. And if you look at the roles that are within P30, you can, there's a quite easily to map these role profiles against those roles in the P30 guidance.
That's brilliant. And just, I think a question to finish on. Can you give us more details of the PMO SIG and especially on your LinkedIn profile?
So the PMO SIG is a specific interest group that is open to anybody and everybody who's either interested in PMO or working in a PMO or is got some kind of relations with the PMO. So even if you're a project or a program manager, we do like you come to our events. We have quite an active community on LinkedIn, so anybody can kind of go onto LinkedIn, just hunt for APM PMO SIG and kind of join us there. and you'll see we have a range of discussions from everything from the role profiles to knowledge management to lessons learned to methods and almost anything and everything in between. And as this is our last question, it's probably worth just kind of going to our last slide, which says the PMO SIG have got the conference next Thursday on the 22nd of October in London. And it's not too late to sign up, and it's a good time to come because it's also our 15th birthday party and there will be drinks to celebrate. So again, you can either find that via the APM website directly under the events tab, or go onto the PMO SIG and LinkedIn and you can find details of it there as well.
That's absolutely fantastic. Guys, have you got any final words for our delegates today?
Well, thank you for joining us. I hope we've given you some pertinent information in your career, or setting up a PMO for that matter. Certainly I wish some of this stuff had been in place 20 years ago when I really needed it, instead of having to make it up.
And certainly if anybody needs any kind of help and guidance, we're both contactable, we're both active members, as we said, of the PMO SIG committee, so we can kind of pick that up at LinkedIn, or you can find us on as independents on LinkedIn, where both labelled, you'll see Simon and his Bib and Tucker again, or just contact us via the APM and they'll direct questions to us and we can be in touch that way. Thanks again for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Just to let you know that the slides will be circulated as well as the recording later on this afternoon. Thank you for your time.